should by now, because
Did we just lose Jonathan?
I think we just
Hit it.
lost Jonathan. I'm sure he'll be right back.
Yeah, I think we lost them.
I hit the wrong button. Can you put me back in the spotlight?
There we
Thanks.
go.
All right. Hi, everybody. Jonathan Cohen here, the Imperial President of NJ Lera, now on my third year. I appreciate everybody for coming out. I think we have a very interesting and topical subject matter to discuss today, which is Chapter 44. For those of you who are arbitrators, neutrals, it's something that you need to know about if you're in the world of school labor negotiations or representation of either management, school boards, or employees. This is something that obviously is hotly contested and is trying to get understood. And even if you're just generally interested in what's going on with healthcare in the public sector or healthcare generally, I think you'll find this topic of immense interest. But I'm going to give it over to one of our board members, Pat Duncan, in a few minutes. Pat, if you don't know him, he used to be with the New Jersey School Board Association. He's remained on our board and is currently a labor specialist at Plainsboro East Windsor Board of Education, or East Windsor Plainsboro. I get that backwards. But before we do that, let me just give you some upcoming events, things to know about that NJ Lera and some of our sister organizations are doing. I don't remember the date, but we did put it out in an email. Rutgers SMLR, one of our great partners, is having a program. So if you look at our emails, you should find out about that. Also, New York Lera is having a program. They've already decided who's going to win the election tomorrow in New York City. Apparently, it's going to be Eric Adams. So I don't know how they knew he was going to win, but apparently they know that. And he's going to they're going to address what to expect from his administration's labor policies. That's on November 8th. If you want more information about that, you could probably Google New York City Lera, or if you want to harass one of us, you could just email the question email and respond back to one of the emails that we have, or email one of us, and we'll be happy to give you the information about what New York City is doing. I'm just joking, of course, about Eric Adams. I think he's heavily favored to win, so I'm sure they will adjust appropriately if by some strange result he does not prevail. For us, though, we have events. Our next event after this one on December 6th is going to be about, we haven't given it a catchy title yet, but it's going to be about police transparency and some of the Attorney General directives. We did a somewhat related program about that last year, but it remains topical. The big thing is if you've got, I think, a 5-day suspension or more than a 5-day suspension, you now police officers become listed in on the reports that become publicly disclosed. And there's also questions about when internal affairs reports can be made public. So that's something that's of immense interest to public sector practitioners. Michael Freeman of the state PBA and I are going to be co-chairing that. So we're going to put together the panel, and you'll hear about that in upcoming weeks. Then we're going to have off for a couple months, I think, unless something very topical happens. And then after that, our next meeting is going to be March 7th. State Board of Mediation, sort of a welcome to the State Board of Mediation, or more information, everything you wanted to know about the State Board of Mediation, but we're afraid to ask. We're doing that with Rutgers University, Lera. So we're going to actually bring in a new chair, Alicia, and she's going to sit down with one of our longtime board members, Jim Kinney, who's a mediator there. And they're going to basically go through all the things that the State Board of Mediation does. We're also going to introduce you to the John R. Burton Scholarship Award winner, who is going to be a Rutgers student who's getting money to pursue their education from some of you folks for everything that you contribute to New Jersey Lera. We're giving back, giving that some of that money for Rutgers, deserving Rutgers student to pursue their career. So that should be a great event. You know, if you're interested in that, or if you want to find out more about the State Board, we hope that you'll come to that as well. And without further delay, let me turn it over to Patrick Duncan, and Pat will give you a PowerPoint overviewing Chapter 44, today's topic, and then introduce our panelists. Thank you so much, and take it away, Pat.
Thank you, Jonathan. As Jonathan said, my name is Patrick Duncan. For a decade or so, I was the manager of the labor relations section at the New Jersey School Boards Association. Currently, I'm the Special Assistant for Labor Relations in the West Windsor Plainsboro Regional School District. But in any event, I've been tasked this afternoon, I guess it's still this morning, of just giving you a little bit of background information on the history of Chapter 44, some of the specifics. I'm not going to do a very deep dive, and then touch on the issue of negotiability of health insurance in Chapter 44 before I toss it to our esteemed panel, and I'll touch a little bit on our panel when I'm done here. I know that the Lera is it's quite a diverse organization in terms of there's a lot of neutrals, there's a lot of people that do police and fire, school labor relations, but also a lot of people that are doing labor relations in the private sector. And I think it might be helpful to just get a broad overview of the law before our panel just kind of dives right in to have that discussion. So very quickly, obviously health insurance has been, why is this? There we go. Health insurance for school employees has a very long history. Prior to 1961, Blue Cross Blue Shield was available to school employees, but at their own expense. The state health benefits plan, which was the pre-runner to the school employees health benefits program, was established in 1961. Now, 7-8 years later is when collective negotiations for school employees started in earnest. And so that was kind of the status quo for quite a long time. In the mid-aughts, that's where we started to see the wave of reforms that we've seen over the last decade and a half or so starting to take place. The first wave of reform was in 2007. And that was, I believe it was referred to as S2, but I may have that wrong. But that's where they separated the school employees health benefits program from the state health benefits plan. So it's just for school employees at that point. And there were some other reforms that they made, including dropping what we refer to as the traditional plan, the 80-20 indemnity plan. Fast forward to 3 years, in 2010, that's the first mandate for employee contributions for their healthcare insurance. Prior to that, that was the exception in terms of employees making contributions, but it certainly did happen. That was every employee had to pay a minimum 1.5% of their salary in exchange for health insurance. 2011 is when the big change happened, and that was Chapter 78. That's where the employee contributions were tied to the employee salary, the cost of the plan. There was kind of a big matrix there, and that supplanted collective negotiations for a 4-year period as that was phased in. And obviously, prior to that, health insurance had been a big topic of negotiations. Is that phased out? And it was on a rolling basis. So Chapter 78 phased out 2015, 16, 17, and 18, depending when the 4-year phase-in started. That's a little bit of inside baseball, but it kind of sets us up for, I think there was, and I'm sure Steve can speak to this more artfully than I can, but there was a lot of, I don't know what to say except unhappiness in terms of the employees. There was a large increase in their contribution over a 4-year period. A lot of associations at the table would argue that their take-home pay decreased over that 4-year period. So there was a lot of pressure on the legislature through the NJEA and on an employee relations standpoint, not necessarily a labor relations standpoint, to make some modifications to the mandated healthcare contributions piece. That's where Chapter 44 comes in. And I'll speak about the specifics of Chapter 44, but the big change from the employee's perspective, it did rather decrease the contributions that they had to make for their health insurance. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a second. 2021, January 1st, 2021 was the implementation date of Chapter 44. And then the following July, on July 7th, is when the Chapter 44 fix came in. And there is another piece of that fix, the plan called the Garden State Health Plan. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. That's kind of in limbo right now. We're not exactly sure what's happening with that. The School Employees Health Benefits Plan hasn't really released specifics on that. Some of this I already talked through, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But some things that may happen in the future with the implementation of Chapter 44, there is going to be kind of a deep dive and look in terms of whether it met there was a goal in the legislation for $300 million worth of savings. And they'll take a close look at that at the end of 2023 to see if changes need to be made to the plan design in 2024. But leaving that aside for a second, at least the original intent of the law was that essentially it precluded a lot of negotiations over health insurance through January 1st, 2028 for school employees and their associations and boards of education. The big piece of Chapter 44, one of the big pieces was there was a development of a new plan called the New Jersey Educator Health Plan. I'm not going to go through the specifics of what's in that plan, but it would have been a materially different health insurance plan, and existing employees could choose whether they wanted to go into that plan or not. But anybody hired after July 1st, 2020, they were mandated that they were going to have to move into the new plan, and that was the status quo for them for insurance purposes for at least the medium term. You can see the contributions. Like I said, there was a decrease in employee contributions if they chose the New Jersey Educator Health Plan or if they were forced into it because of their date or hire. It was significantly less, probably roughly half of what their contributions would have been under the statutory scheme of Chapter 78. And importantly, the difference is it's not based on a percent of the premium that they pay, but rather it's based on a percent of their salary. So that's kind of a chart of what that looks like at the original iteration of Chapter 44. Some other interesting pieces of that. If you get your insurance through, if a board gets its insurance through the School Employees Health Benefits Program, which as of right now, about 42% of their districts do, 58% of them get it through a private carrier. It also mandated that there were only going to be 3 plans available to those folks. It was Direct 10, which is a plan with a $10 copay, a fairly rich plan. Direct 15, a fairly rich plan, but it has a $15 copay. And importantly, it says regardless of what the collective negotiations provisions in the contract were for School Employees Health Benefits Program participants. And then the original iteration of the law, I've been saying iteration a lot, but the original version of the law did say that for employees that were enrolled in the new New Jersey Educator Health Plan, that there were no other contributions may be required under the collective negotiations agreement. That was the original language in the law. For non-SEJ, for school districts that don't get their insurance through the state plan, there were some other interesting collective bargaining provisions. One is that you couldn't add a new health insurance plan to the panoply of provisions that were open. Again, the original version of the law through December 31st, 2027, unless it resulted in some additional premium cost reductions. And again, there was the provision there that said there were no other contributions were allowed to be instituted for the New Jersey Educator Health Plan. It was dictated by that chart that I showed you earlier in terms of the percentages that employees were going to pay for single coverage or family coverage, depending on their salary, of course. Again, I alluded to this before, but there was a provision in the law that had a target rate of savings, which was $300 million. If by 2023, those targets were not going to be met, then the plan design committee of the New Jersey Educator Health Benefits Plan was supposed to take a run at trying to modify some of the plan provisions for the New Jersey Educator Health Plan. If that didn't work and they were unable to reach an agreement, and I won't get into the political makeup of the plan design committee, but in some respects, it makes it difficult to reach an agreement. then that would fall on the Treasury Department to try to make those, the state treasurer actually to make those modifications to the plan design. I referenced very quickly the Garden State Health Plan, which is a secondary plan that is supposed to be developed under the under Chapter 44. The problem with that is there haven't been any companies that have responded to the request for a proposal. So we're kind of in limbo, even though the law dictates that they're supposed to implement that on January 1st, 2022. Yeah, at West Windsor Plainsboro, we just went through open enrollment. There's nothing really to share with employees. So we're just kind of in a holding pattern to see if we can get that in place before we share that with employees so they can make an informed choice about whether they want to join that plan or not. From the employee's perspective, that would reduce their contributions as well. So it may be, particularly for paycheck sensitive people, it might be something that they might be interested in. This is a chart that I got from the New Jersey Association of School Business Officials. It is a little bit misleading because it, they went out, they asked people to respond to this survey. There's obviously a bias of who responds to the survey and who doesn't. So I wouldn't quite say that it's 83% of people or districts are finding that they're losing money pursuant to Chapter 44. But I think a fair takeaway from that chart is that there are 155 districts that have reported that. So 155 districts is roughly 25% of operating school districts in the state. So it is a significant number of school districts that are losing money pursuant to that. So what do you do if you're losing money? The original version of the law, I'm going to be a little bit flippant, but it just said, the parties should discuss it and reach agreement about how they're going to mitigate the cost impact on the board. Really, that didn't have much traction because there weren't any teeth in the original Section 8 of the law. I think there was a recognition on the legislature's part that you needed some more teeth in order to get people actually to the bargaining table. So the Chapter 44 fix that was adopted in July just puts some more specifics there. I'm not going to read through those two paragraphs, but the first paragraph essentially tells you how, in very, very broad strokes, how you go about measuring what the cost impact on the local Board of Education would be. And the second paragraph there is essentially saying it's all on the table, importantly, including making adjustments to the contributions rates of the New Jersey Educator Health Plan, which was strictly off limits with the original version of the bill. So that's, I know I've been speaking quickly and there's a lot to digest there, but I just wanted to give a background to folks that are not familiar with kind of the history of health benefits reform in the school sector over the last decade or so for New Jersey schools. With that said, we have, as I said, we have a very good panel. They're going to have a lot of perspective that's going to be valuable, I think, for our members. First on the panel, Steve Swetsky is the executive director of the NJEA. I think it's fair to say he had a front row seat over the last several years in terms of how the health benefits form was brought to fruition. Probably Chapter 78, but definitely I know Chapter 44. And he has a long history of, before that, of representing folks at the table. So I think he has obviously an incredible understanding of the dynamics of how this may work at the bargaining table. The second person we have on the panel is Mark Toscano. He's a partner, I think, at Comegno Law Firm. He was nice enough to return my phone call when I was looking for somebody who had some experience to do this. And all kidding aside, Mark is a very insightful, very talented board attorney, and we're lucky to have him represent West Windsor Plainsboro. And with that, moderating the panel is going to be Jonathan Cohen, who you saw at the beginning of this Zoom call. And he is the president of Lera, I think, for the second year running. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonathan. You're muted, Jonathan.
Sorry about that. I was only supposed to be president for 2 years, but I'm now in my third year. So I don't know how that works mathematically. But in any event, I will turn it over to Steve to give a 10-minute presentation or however much of it he wants to use, sort of a bit of a 10,000-foot view. And I apologize. Did I say East Windsor rather than West Windsor, Mark?
You did.
They're all nice towns, but West Windsor, Plainsboro. I stand corrected. So Steve, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll hear from Mark for a while.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Patrick, for that kind of laying the groundwork there for today's discussion. Hello to everyone. Thanks to the Lera leadership for A, putting the program together, and B, inviting me to participate on the panel. I appreciate that. It's been a while since I have been to a Lera meeting. And so it's good to be back. Good to see lots of our NJEA colleagues here on the call, as well as some advocates and neutrals that I have worked with in the past, but haven't seen in a while due to some job changes. So it's good to be here. So chapter 44. Yeah, as Jonathan said, I think I do have a bit of a unique perspective around all of this. And some of that is a historical perspective, just based on what I've had the great fortune to be part of for about the last 40 years. And so, I was given this some thought in terms of how to talk about that in the context of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. In my time, I've been a member, right? I've taught for 20 years down in the Washington Township School District in Gloucester County. I became a local leader there, and frankly, at the time I became a local leader, health benefits wasn't really one of those things that was on the agenda for us. Salary was the big topic. Health benefits were one of those things that were part of the contract. My experience at that time, most of the school districts, or many of the school districts, participated in the state health benefits plan. Virtually everyone took the what's been termed the traditional plan back in those days. And actually, we weren't really bargaining over health benefits at that time. And so that started to shift as health insurance costs started to rise. And so what happened was, and I was a local president, chief negotiator at the time, and the board came to us and said, well, we're going to leave the state health benefits plan. And we said, well, why are you going to do that? And they said, well, we can get a better price outside of the plan, right? And it'll be a great plan, and you guys don't have to worry about anything. And we said, well, okay, right? And actually what I did at the time was I picked up the phone and called my field representative at the time and said, hey, we just got notified that the board is going to make a change and they're going to move out of the state. And what does this mean? And it forced us as a local association to really start to think about, talk about, and do research on health benefits and what that meant and what the costs were. As I said, my experience up to that time was that that really wasn't a big part of the negotiations, right? It was kind of just that accepted piece. And frankly, we looked at it at that time as an opportunity, right? Once we started to put together costs, we really approached it from the same kind of way we approached the bargaining, and salary bargaining in particular, which was establish a scattergram, right? What's the base? How much does it cost? How much do people make? What are the steps, right? I mean, all of those pieces that we all know as part of the collective bargaining process are integral to the process. And in our local at that time, we approached the health benefits piece exactly the same way. How many people did we have? What plans did they choose? How much did they cost in the state health benefits plan? And what would the cost be to the district if they moved to this other carrier? And we knew we couldn't bargain the carrier, but we could bargain the level of benefits, right? And all that meant. And long story short, we were able to, at that time, work with our board in that, and we bargained over it, right? I mean, it did not turn into a big negative thing. We had issues that we wanted to deal with, primarily additional money for salary guide issues. And we were able to work with the board, craft a new health insurance plan at that time. I think we went to Cigna, if my memory serves me right, way back in the day. And we were able to craft an agreement and literally, bargained the change in health benefits and agreed as part of a settlement to utilize some of those resources towards the salary. So the board had a savings, right, in what they were paying for health insurance. And we shared that savings by putting some of that money on the salary guide in a way that would have above what the typical settlement would be. So that, that's kind of my first, view of that. And as I got more involved in bargaining, more involved in NJEA, I was hired as a part-time NJEA negotiations consultant in Burlington County. And as I was assigned to work with locals in Burlington County, we started to see there the same kind of story replicate. South Jersey, a lower cost environment for health insurance costs, more proposals coming from boards to move out of the state health benefits plan into some private carrier. And so we were bargaining over health benefits in the South Jersey area. I'm going to say probably a good 5 to 10 years ahead of the rest of the state. And it wasn't every place, because in many places they were comfortable just staying with the state plan, but we were starting to see that. And when I moved to NJEA full-time as a field representative, I'm still working in that Burlington County office, was right around the time that costs associated with post-retirement medical benefits for school employees, certainly are concerned, but all public employees under the law, started to become an issue with the state budget. And Governor Corzine was in office at the time, and he contacted us and said, listen, we have to really look at these health benefits in retirement. And, we're not sure if we're going to be able to maintain fully paid health insurance in retirement the way it is. And we engaged at NJEA in some conversations about, well, why don't we look at this a little bit differently? Why don't we look at post-retirement medical and what else is out there now? And by then, PPOs, preferred provider options, had become more commonplace. And so NJEA put a team together, and I want to recognize my partner in crime on here out there someplace, Kevin Kelleher, who's the deputy executive director at NJEA and who at the time worked in our research division. And our research folks got very involved in working with the state hand in hand to look at the offerings from the state health benefits plan and what that could turn into. And were there options to that? And so the driver of costs at the state level, because as I think most of us know here, the state pays for the cost of post-retirement medical benefits, not local districts, which is different in education versus in the other public employee areas, police and fire, where municipalities and it's post-retirement costs and those pieces are bargained differently than in the education piece of this. And so it was, what could we do? And so that was when, as Patrick kind of points out, the school employee health benefits plan was created, the traditional plan was eliminated, and the Direct 10 came into being as a PPO that was offered as literally the base plan now from the state level to retirees, but also actives, districts who were participating in the school employee health benefits plan. I think that's really very connected to what we're talking about here today, because that was a state level change that essentially was imposed at that level from the state level on down. It impacted virtually every single school district. So 600 districts roughly and 900 contracts, all who had contracts that were written to either reflect the state plan as the base plan, or if they were in a private carrier, referencing the state plan or the traditional plan. So in virtually 600 different versions of contracts, there was language that either referenced the state plan, connected it to the state plan, made the state plan itself the basis, right? And, as we talk about moving forward and bargaining and what does this all look like moving forward, I would offer we've done this before, right? This isn't the first time we've dealt with state level changes that have impacted local collective bargaining. And so that became the standard, right? From 2007 moving forward, that became the standard. The direct 10, a PPO as the base plan. Districts bargained their language to match that. And in places it took 1, 2, sometimes 3 rounds of collective bargaining to make that work. And to kind of let that mesh out and through the process. And then we continue to move forward with that. And again, chapter 2, right? Establishing a minimum contribution of 1.5%. At that time, the vast majority of districts, public school employees were not contributing to health insurance, but that was a start. Chapter 78, as has been pointed out, was a dramatic change, right? Not a plan that was, implemented at the state level, but legislation that directly impacted the ability of associations representing members in public school districts to bargain over the contribution, right? So something that had essentially always been negotiable was now not negotiable and had been instituted outside the collective bargaining process. And so through that 4-year ramp up, through all of the different permutations of that, new employees go to tier 4 to start, right? I mean, there were all different pieces of all of that came together. A lot of angst for sure. But what really, 2 things, maybe more than 2, but I'll start with 2. 2 things. One, absolutely, public school employees' take-home pay was absolutely reduced and continued to be reduced for a period of 4 years as districts ramped up to the tier 4. And the collective bargaining process had been circumvented around contributions to health insurance. And for that period, there were no negotiations allowed over those contributions. And then when Chapter 78 sunset, right, the only thing that really sunset was the limitation on bargaining, right? Chapter 78, the contributions, the chart, all the pieces of Chapter 78 remained. What came off at the sunset was was now an ability to bargain over the Chapter 78 contribution piece. And that happened in different places all across the state. And yes, there's no question about it, as our members continue to see the negative impact of Chapter 78, and everybody talked about these things called unintended consequences, right? If you talk to legislators, they said, well, we wanted to, we thought there should be contributions, but the level of contributions now was an unintended consequence of Chapter 78. And there was discussion, and there was, I think, a general belief out there that something needed to happen. The question was, what is the something that needed to happen? And I think some of those, obviously, some of those are political, right? The person sitting in the governor's office has a huge impact on those kinds of issues. Leaders in the legislature, and just generally, I think by that time, everyone had seen the outcome, had seen the impact of Chapter 78, and it really had gotten to a point where, I believe there was a groundswell of support for some change, whatever that change looked like. And a piece of that then comes back around, right? And by now, again, just to kind of connect my connection to this, right? I've moved on from being a field rep. I've been a manager of our Uniserv division, and I've moved into a position as the assistant executive director, and shortly after with Chapter 44, the executive director. And we engaged with conversations at a number of levels. And one of the first things that started this conversation, and I think a move towards it, revolved around post-retirement medical again, right? The state, through the administration, was interested in modifying the insurance plan for education employees who receive their post-retirement medical through the school employees health benefits plan. And there were discussions and eventually agreement on the creation of a new plan, right? As part of that, kind of recasting post-retirement medical benefits for school employees in a way that saved the state money and still provided a robust insurance plan for those folks who had earned that. We also took the time at that time to create a new plan called the Direct Zero plan, which was really just a plan for active employees that was based on the changes that had been made for the plan for post-retirement benefits for school employees. And so that discussion then led to what other changes could be made. And so we engaged in conversations with legislative leaders across the spectrum. Speaker of the Assembly, members of the Assembly, Senate President, members of the Senate, draft legislation, all talking about ways that we could come up with and develop and implement new ways of looking at health insurance that modified level of benefits that would create savings, additional savings in premium, a way to look at contributions so that the shared concept of sharing the savings, and I go back to my experience back in the mid 80s back in Washington Township, it's very similar, right? Savings by making a change in a level of benefits, sharing that savings with the employees who are covered by that and the employers who pay the bulk of the premium. And so that's really how Chapter 44 was developed. It was developed in partnership with legislative leaders. It was developed in partnership with the administration. There was a huge piece of it that we kept referring back to, collective bargaining, the concept that we would again create a change at the state level that would impact 600 school districts as employers, and really to try and anticipate and think through what those issues could be, but recognizing it's impossible, right? Just like it was impossible when the traditional plan was eliminated, to anticipate and write legislation that dealt with every nuance of every one of the contracts in 600 school districts. How close can we get? And that really is where that language came from in the original Chapter 44 bill, that talked about if there was an opportunity where a school district would be impacted negatively by Chapter 44 in terms of their costs, right? Calling for the employer and the majority rep to engage in collective negotiations. I think there was a belief that we're a pretty advanced state here in New Jersey related to collective bargaining. We know what that means, right? It means that the employer and the employee representative organization meet to negotiate over the impact of that. Apparently needed a little more oomph, I guess, as Patrick described it. So there was an amendment developed and passed this past June, which kind of a little further defines what that means. But essentially, it goes back to, again, what I talked about, my early experiences in bargaining health benefits. Who are the employees? What plans do they have? What are the costs associated with it? What's the impact of the potential changes to the plan? Come to some agreement, right, over what it all means, and then come together collectively to bargain over the impact of it. And that's really the premise of Chapter 44 in both its original form and its amended form, was to deal with those issues through the processes that we all know. And by the way, nobody does it better than New Jersey, right? We have good, strong advocates on both sides of the table, as represented by this group here at Lera. And that's where we find ourselves today. And I'll just add this to kind of wrap up and turn it over to Mark for his perspectives. But, there is a belief, I believe, among all of us that, either from the union perspective or for the employer perspectives, that things are better when we figure out ways to resolve issues together, right? It just makes for a better workplace. It makes for a more productive workplace. It provides for all of that. That's a component of the piece in the law that set this out for 7 years. There was a real want and a need and an agreement at the end that it was time for some stability around the issue of health benefits, health insurance programs, and employee contributions. And that's what Chapter 44 was really designed to do. So while yes, always going to be issues that pop up, and that's why we have processes in place through contracts, through PERC, through the commissioner's office to resolve those conflicts. The best place for them to be resolved is at the local level with the people who know those issues best, and to move forward from that. And I think that's what the law was written to do, and I think that's what the law has provided. And I'll leave it there for now, turn it over to Mark for his perspective, and then we'll see what everybody else wants to talk about. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And, it was interesting to hear from one of the architects of the law. One way you could tell Steve's involvement is I've got the law here. The beginning of every sentence, if you read it down, it says Steve Swetsky, Steve Swetsky, Steve Swetsky. So you could tell he was really involved with it. Now Mark has actually had to deal with it, at the bargaining table. And, obviously the amendment to it, and just in case anybody's looking for that, the amendment to it, which we've been citing a lot, that was Assembly Bill 5825 of the 2021. I'm not sure. Does anybody know what the law number was of that?
160. I think it's. I've
Yeah.
seen it referred as Chapter 163.
Chapter 163, right? So that's PL 2021, Chapter 163. So you got to read the two in tandem, I guess, right, Mark? And you can take it away.
Yeah. So I first want to echo Steve's opening remarks to thank everybody for one having me on the panel and for putting this program together. I also, as just a general matter, do share strongly the belief that matters such as healthcare are best resolved through the bargaining process and not being legislatively mandated. I've been practicing almost 20 years at this point, really started in the labor relations field right around the time that the accountability regulations were first implemented in 07, followed shortly by the bill which Patrick laid out, Steve discussed, with the elimination of the traditional plan, and really the advent of bargaining for health insurance. And the only thing I would add, just from the school board management side of the table, is as that was progressing, really for the first time, just again, in my experience, and even in looking back, I didn't see it being nearly as volatile. School districts in this state had their funding sources severely disrupted, and it became incredibly volatile. And a direct consequence of that was the need to engage in the bargaining process to find places where there could be potential savings. Because really, in any school district, you have revenue, you have expenses. And when the revenue is disrupted and it is not as constant as it had been, there was a need to look for ways to adjust expenses. And I think that's in part why there was a real start with this in the southern part of the state, and just really spread throughout very quickly. I mean, Patrick did a great job of laying out the laws. They really kind of started on this path, but if you look at the laws implementing contributions, you could almost do a chart identically showing actions taken by the state or laws passed that directly affected school funding. For instance, you had the School Funding Reform Act in 2008 that was set to take place in the 08-09 school year. You had the arrival of then Governor Christie in January of 2010. And I see a lot of colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I sat at a lot of tables with a lot of you, especially during that spring of 2010. That is still seared in my mind, when there was not only the withholding of the final state aid payment, but there was also the drastic cutting of state aid for the then upcoming 10-11 school year. So then we have those magical dates that we have of May 21st, 2010. That was the magic date for implementation of Chapter 2, the 1.5 contribution law. Then with the following year, we have June 28, 2011, which was the magic date for implementation of then Chapter 78. You have the rollout and the full implementation of that. You fast forward a couple of years. Now we have S2, which is another school funding affecting bill, where you have districts, some benefiting, some not benefiting. There's been a lot of press about that. And this is not about that. I'm just saying that you can kind of see the correlation between these mandates and disruptions in the funding piece. so from my vantage point, I kind of see the two kind of going in parallels together. When you have one, the direct effect is the other. I do wish for a return to normalcy. I agree with Steve that some consistency in terms of health insurance and also consistency in terms of state funding and revenue streams will definitely go a long way towards kind of calming the waters. With the signing of Chapter 44, what I saw initially at the bargaining table, because of course, this comes right in the middle of COVID, and we're all, a lot of my colleagues on here together, we were all learning how to bargain through little boxes like this and do it electronically. I had, I believe, eight successor agreements that were hung up on the issue, rightfully so, of employee contributions in Chapter 78 and how that was going to be addressed. I had tons of sessions with Mary Beth and her team at PERC, and they were great. They understood the issues. They grasped them. My colleagues on the other side understood the board's position, but there was really this logjam. And the initial impact of Chapter 44 that we saw at the bargaining table, the front row seat, was really kind of taking that issue that we were logjamming over and kind of taking it off the table, where there was now this uniform alternative for those employees that wanted to get off of the Chapter 78 percentage of premium train for their contributions. So it did have initially a very, very good impact, at least from a management side attorney. I'll probably be shot later for saying that, but I'll offer that there was a positive benefit. Patrick's comment about the last part needing a little teeth, he did a lips over from a board attorney perspective and management relations perspective. For me, the most important part, which was we were finally told how to calculate what the cost was and what if there was loss, how to calculate that. Because I would say that from the outset, when the first iteration of the bill was passed, we were all rushing and scrambling and trying to get enrolled and figuring out everything. And I can tell you that the question I would get constantly from the finance finance portion of the boards of education was, well, how do we calculate loss? Is it premium? Is it premium to premium? Is it less contributions? Do we include contributions? Do we throw contributions out? How do we address that? And that's where I thought the cleanup bill, for lack of a better term, Chapter 163, was very helpful. So much so that, over this summer, we've commenced impact negotiations with several local associations to do exactly as the bill had suggested, to sit down and to start to work through some of those losses. So that was kind of my thought process in hearing Patrick's presentation and Steve's opening remarks, just kind of giving the board, the management side view of the House, in that, while there was, the mandates, a lot of them were also accompanied by drastic volatility in funding and availability of resources for school districts in order to meet obligations under collective negotiation agreements.
Thanks, Mark. So for those of you at home who are playing NJ Lera Bingo, which is a popular drinking game, at 12:16 p.m., Mark said the word COVID, which is actually a record since March of 2020. That's the latest in a meeting that the word COVID has been used. So hopefully those of you who had that on your bingo cards can mark that. I have a question for Steve, and anybody who's got questions in the audience, put them in the chat and I'm going to monitor it. And if any questions come up, I'll direct it towards Steve and Mark. But I want to start with a question to Steve. Mark was talking a little bit about Chapter 2 and Chapter 78 and talking about those magic dates that were included in those statutes. And just having lived through that process at the time, many of us will remember that the legislature gave sort of a window of time and said, okay, you've got until this date to get an agreement through. Otherwise, you have to, pay at the increased contribution rates. They didn't do that this time around. Do you think that there was a recognition that people were going to game the system, or that, maybe that it's just not, why do you think that those laws had those magic dates, quote unquote? Because I remember people coming up with MOAs and trying to ram agreements through, we got to get it done right now before the date, and reopening contracts, and Chapter 78 had slightly different rules than Chapter 2. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit, Steve, I'd be interested to hear how the sausage was made in that regard.
Yeah, actually, there was very little or no discussion, at least on our side, about that. That was I think, at least from our perspective, a recognition that, while that was helpful for the districts that were able to, kind of scramble and get together or whatever, it was a pretty short window, as I recall, and get a a new agreement in place. It just put off, and created actually a whole nother set of timelines, right? We wound up with literally, in dozens of individual timelines of when Chapter 78 started and stopped in districts across the state. I think here there was just recognition that it was time to do something, and that the something should be done, implemented. I don't think that previous look at that really solved any problems. It just didn't allow those places that were able to kind of scramble to say, let's fight about this later. Let's let everybody else figure out how to deal with it, right? We'll add 1 or 2 or 3 years to our current agreement, and let somebody else figure it out. In this case, I think we pretty much thought we tried to make it as simple as possible, and so that it just really wasn't a part of the conversations this time around.
And Mark, do you think that it was probably a good thing, or that you didn't have that creativity, or what was your experience having dealt with those prior laws?
I would say that I think that I think that the window was closed, if I'm remembering correctly, really with Chapter 78. I think I remember there being a specific provision at the end of that bill. And again, I haven't thought about this provision in a long time, but I do remember that there was language in there that it was the agreement on effect on June 28, 2011. But if you entered into another one, there was like that short window of time, and it was disallowed. Because I do remember playing a lot of games, not games, but really rushing to get agreements done prior to May 21, 2010. I do remember that very, very vividly, doing that. And I feel like that it was closed. My only guess would be maybe one of the reasons why this didn't come up as much was I know, not to say the word again, but COVID, this was first announced, I believe, February, Steve, right? February 2020, if I remember.
Yeah,
correctly.
right around, yeah.
And
just pre-COVID. I mean,
right as the
shutdown.
shutdown came, and then everything stopped. And then, as part of, the emergency budget provisions, the extension of the fiscal year from June 30 to September 30, right in the middle of that is this passage. And my guess, Jonathan, is that this was kind of announced, installed quickly. So my guess was maybe the architects, and again, Steve was in the room, it wasn't really as big of an issue. They were really looking for this to kind of get going, because of kind of, I think, the events surrounding its passage and adoption.
I throw one more thing in there. I mean, there was a real, obviously, in Chapter 44, there was a absolute lot of discussion, and the bill reflects it, over the shared savings that would result from it. And so there was a, absolute intent, I think, on all the parties to get to that as quickly as possible, right? And there was another component here that doesn't get talked about a lot, but we spent a lot of time talking about, districts who were in the school employee health benefits plan at the time, relatively easy to implement this. Districts who were out, not in, so either had their own plan, however that worked. We wanted to maintain the ability of districts to kind of deal with that collective bargaining aspect. And so this was not implemented right on 100% of the employees at the beginning, right? So it was tiered, right? The belief was that people would look at this, they would do a personal calculation over the health level of benefits, they would run their numbers, how much could they save, right, in contributions, and they would make a decision on that. There was the piece where new employees would automatically be enrolled in the educator health plan, right? And then so the idea was that there would be kind of a ongoing, migration, right, of current employees and new employees into that. Going back to April's numbers, 37% of the covered employees in the school employees health benefits plan were in the New Jersey Educator Health Plan. And so we'll see what this next open enrollment now brings, right? As we have more experience, people had a year under their belt, they talked to their colleagues about, hey, I was in that plan, I saved, $2,000 and I didn't see any difference when I went to the doctor, right? And so the goal really is to move over that, 7-year period to a point where, the majority of school employees would be in that plan, right? And the districts, the employers would reap the benefits of lower premiums. And some of those changes that were made have resulted in lower premiums, right? And that, didn't talk about it here, but the school employee health benefits plan just announced, right, that there's going to be a premium holiday for districts participating in that in February, which is a 1 month, savings, additional savings, right? And that's part of the Chapter 44 amendments as well. And again, sharing of those savings, right? District saves 1/12 of what they pay towards those premiums. Employees save 1/12 of what they contribute to those premiums. And so there's a lot of other pieces connected to this, right? Those changes have impacted, driving people to in-network providers, where there's some control over costs, has an impact on premium. And it's all part of the next generation, right? Same thing we did when we went from traditional to a PPO. Now a PPO with higher out-of-network costs, right? And more modified chiropractic and physical therapy and those pieces is driving down some of those costs. And that's really the goal too, right?
I've had more conversations at the bargaining table about out-of-network usage, chiropractic care, and again, that, I would echo the sentiment that I think that by having the provision in the bill that not only new employees, but even, new hires, new to the system, but also new employees, anybody kind of coming in. So if you're changing from District A to District B, you are going to have that migration by the end of this, with a vast majority of folks are in that particular plan.
That's helpful. And, to answer my own question a little bit, I think that Chapter 2 was a drastic change, right? In terms of now management has a tool, basically, let's get the other things that we want. Otherwise, you're going to pay a lot more towards health benefits. Probably most people weren't paying anything in 2010 towards health benefits, right?
I had some districts, and I just want to clarify this. I did have some districts, there's this misnomer out there that nobody was contributing. And that wasn't the case. There were places where we had successfully negotiated employee contributions, and that process was working, albeit it was slower. But it was out there. I would offer that, because I've heard that misnomer before.
Yeah, because I wanted to hit you with that, because you referenced that someone might shoot you on the way out the door because of your relatively soft stance. When people get in front of board clients or municipalities, they talk about how necessary Chapter 78 was and things like that. But then at Lera, everyone talks about, oh, it's so terrible, they legislated healthcare. So, I just, would, I guess, I think you kind of answered the question. I know which direction you're going to go, Mark, but for people that are watching and they say, I guess people say, I've heard someone say that if taxes are your issue, you probably shouldn't live in New Jersey. But, and I've heard people also say that we have the best school districts in New Jersey, in the entire country. But, if not for Chapter 78, I mean, I think it's a fairly objectively true statement. We never know if you play that counterfactual. I mean, maybe, Mark, some of your districts were making some sorts of negotiations or some sort of concessions, maybe paying co-pays, things like that. But, at least the talking point when Governor Christie was elected was that there was a big disparity between the public sector and the private sector in terms of the people who are paying the taxes ostensibly are the private sector people who are all, contributing heavily towards their health insurance, which has gone up a long time since it was super easy fringe benefit to give away, like Steve described in the 1970s, whereas now it's this huge cost driver, $30,000, $40,000 worth of traditional plan cost, right? And so, without that, right, and now maybe the pendulum swung so far the other way in terms of Chapter 78. If you're a teacher and you've been on the guide for 25, 30 years, right, you're an administrator, you're making $100,000, you're paying a family plan, you're probably paying more, relatively speaking, than somebody in the public sector, in the private sector. And not only that, but your raise on the guide is probably eaten up almost entirely under Chapter 78 by health insurance contributions. So, I guess number one, defend yourself that you would have done it and people like me would have done it on our own without the help of Governor Christie and the legislature doing our jobs for us and basically making the unions contribute. And number two, is it a matter of the pendulum just swinging so far this way that Chapter 44 is sort of a recognition, let's kind of make things a little bit more manageable instead of, because if you've got to keep people on, you've got the right to keep people on the top tier, right? That was one of the last, I think that's been explained, reference, right? That was the status quo, right? And that's what you said earlier. Status quo was the last tier of Chapter 78. And now you can't do that anymore. So you just answer my questions, I guess, if you can.
Okay, I'll do my best. What I would say first off is I want to gather my thoughts for a second. It was a good number of questions. Yeah. What I would say first, insofar as the Chapter 44, Chapter 78, kind of the necessity of it at the time. Again, anybody that has sat at the negotiations table with me, I've always been very honest with them and really explained that the boards of ed that I work with and our position is always based really on the lack of the revenue stream. That's kind of why I referenced it in my opening remarks. And I think that those pieces were necessitated in part by the volatility that was disrupted. I mean, I cannot understate the impact that the spring of 2010 had on school districts. I mean, that was the first real time you had massive layoffs, outsourcing of positions. You had huge disruptions, and part of me thinks that 78, while yes, there were places where that this process was not working, I also think, and I said it at the table to a lot of the folks that are here today representing the union side, I would say, listen, what this administration has quote unquote given us in terms of mandated employee contributions, a lot of times he has taken away in loss of state aid. So really it was kind of one hand and the other that was going on. And Steve, do you echo those sentiments? That was a lot of what was transpiring.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think there's even another part to that, right? In the run up to the legislation dealing with contributions, at least when I was bargaining, right, there was always a willingness on the association's part, because boards were always proposing contributions, right? And
always,
our associations were resisting the contributions, but those were then reflected in the salary settlements, right? I mean, there was that's another piece of this that doesn't often get talked about, right? In terms of, and it's why you look at educator salary guides versus some other public employee salary guides. I'll use police and fire, kind of examples, right? I mean, the differences in salaries in some cases are significant in many cases. And so part of that is the way bargaining is done, but so there may not have been contributions, but there were it was reflected in the overall cost of employees, right? I'll put it that way. And as you were kind of going through the school funding piece of this, I'm jotting some notes down. I mean, and essentially, listen, Chris Christie imposed, right, with help from the legislature, salary cuts, right, to essentially fund schools, as you point out, where aid was being cut, right? And you could almost match it up almost dollar for dollar, right?
Stabilization aid was,
Yeah,
was,
I
was
mean,
straight
those
across.
cuts, those salary or those compensation cuts could never have come at the bargaining table, right? The state would have come to a halt, but they were imposed right outside the collective bargaining process, and it literally was taking money from employees, wallets, right, in terms of contributions, and using that money, right? No argument on our side. We tracked it and watched almost the exact same thing, and used that money to keep staff, right, or to keep programs, or to balance school district budgets, right? No question about it. But again, that it is a more complicated, kind of a system, right? And it's what collective bargaining is all about, right? And so that's why, in some ways, handling it at the local level makes sense. In other ways, 600 versions of solving the same problem it never would have happened that way. There would have been labor issues across the state, had those cuts tried to be imposed in 600 school districts at one time. So yeah, but it is, and I think the pendulum analogy is a good one too.
So the paradigm now is shifted away from Chapter 78. We're back at the negotiations table. And I'm gonna read Kathleen Asher from New Jersey School Board's question in a moment. But just to direct everybody's attention, there's been a lot of references to Section 8 of Chapter 163, which basically says, if I understand it correctly, that you do need to negotiate contribution levels, including with respect to what was set forth previously as in Chapter 44 is saying, okay, so here's what needs to be in the New Jersey Educators Health Plan, right? And basically this is what the state's going to do for the SEHBP program. Am I understanding that correctly? And that says, if you're not SEHBP, you've got to create an equivalent program. And then here's the contributions you've got to pay percentage-wise. Then Chapter 163 comes back and says, well, actually, you don't necessarily have to pay out those contributions. You can negotiate something else, which is a lot different than Chapter 78. And I'll give that to you, Mark, and then we could read Kathleen's question.
I was just gonna say, the way I read it is the condition precedent in order for getting into that is there has to be a loss. And that, to me, there has to be a loss as a result of the implementation of Chapter 44. If you satisfy that condition precedent, then you get to the bargaining table with the association. And one of the tools that you can use is modification of the contributions, which if you don't satisfy the condition precedent, that is not something that is at your disposal. That's kind of how I interpreted that provision. That's how I've implemented it thus far.
That's great. So before I give it to Steve, I think that segues into Kathleen's question. So assuming it's a condition precedent, meaning you got to cost it out. And I think during our discussions leading up to this meeting, we're talking about that's really one of the hardest things to do, right? Is trying to find out what the economic impact is going to be. And that's going to drive negotiations. If that's a condition precedent before you could start negotiating, who does that? How is it done? Is there a role for a mediator? And go to Kathleen Asher's question. She says, has anyone been to PERC mediation or fact-finding negotiating Chapter 44 impact? How has it gone? And I know, Steve, you're not generally at the negotiations. So after you're done, we could let Mark answer that question more specifically. But if you could just kind of backpack on what Mark said, and then maybe talk about how you think in your experience on basically all sides of the table from the union perspective, at all sides of the process, how this cost out should be done and how it could be done amicably.
Yeah, so there's a reason the original paragraph was in Chapter 44, and it really was looking at the initial implementation, right? And I think the farther we get away from the initial implementation of Chapter 44, the more difficult it is to make an argument now that there's been some loss, right? But when that plan was implemented last year, and it goes to the question that New Jersey ASBO kind of posed to its members, right? 181 districts or whatever on that little survey replied, well, we think there's a loss, right? Right now, we're aware of about 10 places that are actually discussing or negotiating over the impact of Chapter 44. There's a big disconnect there, right? So it has to go back to, and I use the salary guide scattergram analogy again, right? There's a reason we start with a base year, which is every time I ever did it was the last year of the current contract. And in this analogy, 2019 was the last year of Chapter 78 / SEHBP, Direct 10, Direct 15, Direct, all of that. So that is really the base year. The comparison should be, right, from the first year of implementation, looking back at the base year and taking into account whatever differences come into play from that, right? Because people move from plan to plan, people leave, people come and pick different plans, right? But just as in salary negotiations, like we come to an agreement over the what is, right? And then we say, we're going to stick with this, right? This is what we're going to use moving forward to develop successor salary guides, right, as part of the settlement. And it breaks both ways, right? Sometimes the boards are winners, right? In terms of if more people leave, if there's more breakage, sometimes the associations are winners. If there's less breakage, whatever, how that works out, we all agree to it at the beginning. And fundamentally, that was the design here. Was we knew there were districts that had bargained plans that were even lower cost than the educator health plan, right? We knew that. And so really that was, in our mind, that was going to be the place where the problems were going to be, right? And there was almost an immediate impact that could have been dealt with right then. So to get to the question, I don't think any of those 10 districts that at least we're aware of and working with have gone as far as mediation or fact finding yet, or rolled it into a successor negotiation as provided for in the amendments. I'm not aware of any. Mark may be.
We had one where we had negotiation sessions about 2 weeks ago, and we were able to reach an amicable agreement that both sides were able to go with for a change that would address the funding shortfall. Because to Steve's point, that was one of those districts that had negotiated a base plan that was less than the educator plan. And then when folks migrated into direct, this was a place where they got hit kind of both ways. They got it with folks going to the direct 15 as well as going to the educator plan. So they kind of got to hit both sides, and both sides knew it sitting down that this was going to come up, and we were able to address it. But really, what helped that process was developing that scattergram in terms of what is the loss, how are we measuring it, how are we quantifying it. We could disagree a couple dollars here or there, other direction, but we both generally had the same framework in mind as to what we were discussing.
So Mark, during our preliminary discussions, you were talking about how to come up with a scattergram, probably one that the union will agree with, because it's not spelled out in the statute,
No.
right? But those of us who've done police and fire, interest arbitrations and things like that, usually you pick a point in time, right? So you freeze that point in time because there's a lot of moving parts. You were talking about in a preliminary discussion, people could theoretically obviously get hired and go into the New Jersey Educators Health Plan. You've got other people with family changes, people who might pick a cheaper plan if it were available to them. So just talk about how do you go with that, and then throw a wrinkle. What do you do if your school district doesn't like to do it the way that you want to do it, and they want to show a bigger loss?
Well, I can speak to what we did in the one place where we were able to successfully reach agreement. What we did was we took the base year, which was the last year prior to implementation. We looked at what we had. We then pulled out of the calculation, if you will, any employees who might have changed plans. They went from maybe they were single, they got married, husband and wife, or they went to a family plan. We pulled those folks out. We pulled new hires out. We kind of pulled both buckets out together and really tried to distill it down so that we were kind of looking at the dollars, showing direct impact costs as to actual folks that were physically there. That's really how we did it. And we were very deliberate in that, and we watched it over 2 enrollment periods to make sure that what we saw initially was in fact the case.
So you agree with that methodology, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. First of all, I agree with it because that's what they agreed to do in that district, right? So
Sure.
the first thing is let's agree on how we're going to figure out how to agree. And so apparently they came up with a way to do that. And again, there are nuances to the calculations, but calculations are calculations, right? It's how many people, what plans do they have, how much do the plans cost, how much did they contribute, how much do the new plans cost, how much will they contribute, and the number pops out at the bottom.
So you could use perk mediation or fact finding if you're hitting problems, right? But theoretically, to our mediators and arbitrators that are on the line, I don't know if this will happen, but this is sort of something that could come their way, right? Is, hey, we're having a difference of opinion as to this issue. Can you help figure it out for us? There's nothing that would stop parties from agreeing to hire an arbitrator for that purpose, right?
I don't think so. No.
No, I don't think, no.
All right, so something may come your way, folks. I have a question about non-SEHBP versus SEHBP. So let's say I'm private plan, okay, and I'm reading this law. It says I've got to create an equivalent plan to the New Jersey Educators Plan, NJEHP, whatever it is, right? So those of us who been haunted over the decades, substantially similar, equivalent, this contract language. Now you've got the legislature just saying equivalent without saying what it is. And we've actually got a case on my law firm. We've got Rich Friedman, who's not on the call, so maybe I could fish for an answer from you guys as to how you would handle this. But we have a school district that's in a private plan, and when they created the equivalent, so to speak, plan, it was different in terms of what our broker provided for dependents. In our case, dependents came off of the plan on their 26th birthday, whereas there was a SPD, a summary plan description, that was going around from the state. It hadn't been ordained by the legislature, obviously, saying, I think, something different, that dependents would be on until the end of the calendar year after they turn 26. So we moved to dismiss. What happened was Zali filed with the Commissioner of Education, and said that they're violating the statute. We moved to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction, and we said they're trying to interpret what's basically a state health benefit program plan design, and the ALJ went and got even more nuanced than us and said, you know what, we disagree with Cohen and Plosia. We don't think necessarily that if it's one of these things that is literally put out into the statute, $125 for an emergency room stay unless you get admitted or something like that, that could be within the ambit of the commissioner for a non-SEHBP district. But if it's something like dependent, which isn't actually even in the statute, then you're really asking the Commissioner of Education to figure out something that's not even in the law. So I don't know what you guys think about the result of that case, or where that may go, but I don't know if either of you heard anything in that sort of fact scenario that you find interesting or worth discussing, giving me ideas on how I could win the case, maybe.
Well, far be it from me to give you advice on how to win that case, but I would go back to the elimination of the traditional plan. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, I don't know, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of cases very similar to that scenario, right? Where a non-state health benefits plan district had to create, right, a version of the Direct 10, let's say, and they did, right? They went to their insurers, they said, here's the plan, they created the plan. And then we got into these nuances of, well, did the plan match exactly all of the components of the plan it's supposed to be matching, right? And, over time and, grievances and ULPs and case law, most of those settled out and, created, some basis for argument around all of those. I think we're going to be in the same kind of position here. Those cases are going to pop up, right? Probably roughly half the districts in the state are in private carriers. Those private carriers all had to create, a version, right, of the school employees health benefits plan, the New Jersey educator plan. There's going to be spots where there are going to be issues just like that one, and the parties are going to have to figure out how to resolve those, through how we resolve those things. So I think a little early on that one, to kind of, still early in that process on that particular case from my understanding, and let's see where that goes, because that'll help drive those conversations in other districts that might deal with that issue.
And quick legal fact before I give it to Mark, I actually got an email from a guy who represents a lot of charter schools after that. He said to me, he had similar petitions filed before the commissioner, because the law does apply to charter schools that have collective negotiations units. But anyway, anything out of that discussion, equivalent plan, Mark, that,
What I'll say is, I would not be surprised if the commissioner concurs with the ALJ and doesn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. That's all I would add. I don't see the Commissioner of Education really as the venue for those types of disputes. That would be my thinking. This is not really their what the department deals with on a day in and day out basis.
And that was our argument largely, was that, but it was the 18A statute.
I agree. Listen, I know this stat. It's 18A 6-9. Anything arriving under the school laws, I just don't. That's all I would add. I don't see the department wanting to go into this area.
So if anybody's got ideas on how we could win, our exception brief is due tomorrow to defend it. I'm just kidding. But anyway, so let's say it were not filed in the commissioner, which, maybe it shouldn't have been, in court or in PERC. What do you do? You've got a client as a school district, the broker's coming back and saying, we can't write it up exactly the way that the NJEHP is, right? So you've got to try to make it as close as possible. And try to figure out what equivalent means, which is what we've been dealing with for years, right?
Yeah. That would be my sentiment. And then, what I would say then is, what is the impact of any difference?
So when you get the condition precedent, right, meaning that you can demonstrate that there's a loss. What do you foresee as being the types of negotiations that you're going to be handling at the table with unions? In terms of, how do we come out with a deal that's satisfactory to both parties from a health contribution perspective? Are there going to be a lot of people moving into the state plan, or what do you see happening?
Well, I can tell you what we did do in the one practical aspect is we did. So this was a district that was in the state plan, for lack of a better term, for the health insurance piece, but was doing private prescription. And so, the solution really was sliding the whole kit and caboodle into the state plan in light of the rates, the solution presented itself. And then that got into the discussion of the impact of changing that provider and how to address any issues, whether it was equivalent or substantially similar to, and that was really what the crux of our negotiations, our impact negotiations was about.
See,
yeah, so I have a question for Mark in that. And so is it in that district, kind of accepted now that they've dealt with the issue, right? They came to some agreement on what that meant, and moving forward, they're just moving forward now, right? So
yeah. So it's actually written in. We did a sidebar to the existing agreement, because the existing agreement was signed, ironically enough, March 5th, I want to say, right before the shutdown. I think we were the last in-person mediations. before everything kind of grinded to a halt. But what we did was, we agreed that this was how this was addressed, and that this is how we're implementing it, and it made specific reference to Chapter 44 and the losses incurred as a result of the implementation.
So you still
Yeah,
probably have, I'm sorry, Direct 10, Direct 15 in most districts. You've got the NJ EHP as a possibility. Just so everybody walks away understanding the impact of the new law, the Chapter 2, if I'm correct, that still sets the floor, right? So you can't contribute
1.5.
anything. 1.5% of base salary. Chapter 78 was a percentage of premium.
Mhm.
Right? But
Yes.
that floor of Chapter 2, Governor Christie's first thing, which we didn't see the next year him hitting us even harder with the next thing, but that 1.5% of base salary is the floor. But what's the status quo, if anything, with regard to the new plan? Is it the contribution rates that are set forth in Chapter 44? If you've got a loss and you then get into bargaining, do you have a status quo? I mean, do those numbers mean anything?
I think they mean a lot, right? I mean, they're
Okay.
written into the law. They're written into the law through 2027. There's a carve out, right, for districts that can show that there was some negative impact to the new plan and the new contribution schedule and all of those pieces. That was kind of to my point a little earlier. I don't anticipate that there are going to be hundreds of districts, right, that are going to be commencing impact bargaining over Chapter 44. I just think, we're a year into it now, right? And if those discussions haven't at least started, or, some level of, communication and agreement on, those numbers or what the loss is, or if there's a loss, the farther we get away from that implementation year, the harder it's going to be to go back and say, we're suffering a loss from something that was implemented 2 years ago. So like I say, I think, I know the language was put in there purposefully, right? To provide that, kind of at the very beginning of the implementation of the law, that the parties would engage in collective negotiations over the impact. We know what that means, right? If an employer makes a decision unilaterally that we say violates, the law, the contract, whatever, we demand bargaining over it, right? In this case, the onus for the demand to bargain over it was on the employer. And
Well, the first ones I've ever written. Sorry, I don't mean to jump in, Steve. I got to write a demand to bargain. It was entertaining.
Yeah, no, but I mean, and again, that was, these were all part of the discussions. I would venture to say there were more discussions around this particular law from a development and implementation view through all the parties, whether it be the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor's office, than 99.9% of any other legislation that I'm aware of that's been drafted, right? We really tried to anticipate, right, and allow and protect the collective bargaining aspects of this. Because Jonathan, you referenced this, but I'll come at it a little different way. In the out of state plan districts, right, there's all kinds of plans that have been bargained, right? It's not just the Direct 10 or the
Sure.
Direct 50. There's still traditional plans floating around
Yeah.
out there, right? The law was written in a way that allowed districts to bargain over what they had already bargained over, and to either keep it, right, or to mutually come to some agreement to modify it. But to layer on top of that, whatever they had bargained, to layer on top of that, the educator health plan, the contribution schedule, right? Because remember, except for new employees, migration to it was voluntary, right, by the employee.
So we're running out of time, but the last thing I'd like to ask each of you before we break, we might go a minute or two over. You take a crystal ball out. I think we say Chapter 2 was viewed by Christie and possibly the legislature as a remedial statute to move things in a certain direction. Didn't work. It wasn't final, obviously. Chapter 78, same thing. After the sunset, didn't finish it. Is this, you guys have been very nice and civil. Perhaps that's just your demeanor. But what I'm hearing from talking to the two of you is that, this is something that's workable for both sides. So crystal ball, is it possible that this is it? This is the end of the trilogy in terms of contribution legislation. We might not need anymore.
My vote is no. I think that there's always going to be a tweak. There's always going to be, I think that we've gotten on the train of mingling, and we get in there. I mean, as I joke with young attorneys that will start at our firm, I say, well, look, here's 18A. It's one of the thickest chapters. So I don't believe that they're done. That's just my personal vantage point.
Steve?
Yeah, and I think I know the concept of, putting a date in there, just like in chapter 78, right? I mean, there was a date in there, the premise, let's implement this, through this time, then we'll turn it back over to collective bargaining, and we'll see what that looks like. Legislation then followed, working on that. I mean, listen, I'd be nuts if I said I didn't think at some point post 2027, that there weren't going to be more discussions or more, you'll have, whatever it is, 7 years of a look, right? And see how it's impacted and how has it worked out and what are the costs and where is health benefits? Who knows where health benefits will be, at that point, right? But at least we've established a glide path right now for what it is now in school districts. And the future will be the future. We'll see what it is.
Well, nevertheless, I've detected from both of you a sort of a sense of optimism. I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, we had a PERC meeting or talking about chapter 78, things like that. People in the crowd almost came to blows. I think if we were live in person, we wouldn't have that today. So this is really what New Jersey Lera, I think, is about, is bringing people together from management side, from the union side, from the neutral side, and all of us get on the same page because we have to live together and work out whatever issues what we have. So it is refreshing to hear that, I think we're heading that way when it comes to school districts have the opportunity now to sit down with unions and work out deals that nobody feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. So, I thank both of you for coming out, and Pat, his PowerPoint was something that will be available for people on our website. And if people want copies, you can email us, and I'm sure Pat will be good enough to make that. I don't want to say I'm sure, maybe you trademarked it. He's going to try to get rich off of it. So I don't want to speak for him, but I suspect he'll be willing to share that. So I'd like to thank everybody who came to this event. Sometimes people stick around and ask some questions. There's no obligation for anybody to do that. But if people want to hang out in this room, I think we could keep it available. We'll stop the recording right now, though. There we go.